back with this week's edition of Storytime with Sterling. Sterling McGinn taking a look at some of the great history information for the Newberry area. And Sterling, today we're talking about cars.
Yes, we're going to look at when the cars first came to the Newberry area.
All right, what do you got for us this week?
Well, around the turn of the century, many of the small towns across the country were starting to see the transition from the horse and buggy to the horseless carriage, and this was the early 1900s. At that time, though, business owners and wealthy people were the only ones that could actually afford a automobile, but Henry Ford changed that. He created the Model T, which was available for the average individual. So we're going to look at when the first car came to Newberry.
Okay, when did the first car come to Newberry?
Well, one of the earliest indications was in a local section of the Newberry News in 1904, and the item was talking about Dr. Perry, Dr. H.E. Perry. He broke his wrist while attempting to crank his car. In those days, the engines were started by cranking the engine, and if the engine kicked, the crank was not held properly, it could cause somebody to break their wrist or arm. So that was one of the earliest indications, was 1904, but it didn't really say what brand of automobile it was. And another early thing was from 1905, and it was kind of humorous. It was in the Newberry News, and it said that while his touring car was autoing up the hill to the hospital last Sunday, the what do you call it got tangled up with the eccentric and slipped the cog, bringing the machine to a standstill. When the chef came along with Kitty Bell, Doc asked for a tow, but the pony held her nose and refused to associate with such a vile-smelling vehicle. One of the other earliest cars in Newberry was owned by Doc Gregory, and he was a local dentist, and he had purchased an Orient buckboard, and it was a single-cylinder air-cooled air-cooled engine. And that was one of the other early cars. And I did come across something in the 1932 Newberry News that was interesting. Ed Montcalm, who later lived in Newberry, but at the time in the 30s he was living in Munising, he had an Orient buckboard, and he came to Newberry on his way to. He was heading to Detroit to enter his Orient car in the oldest car in Michigan contest. But anyway, that brought back a lot of memories of Doc Gregory's car in Newberry. Some of the old pioneers remembered that. And one of the early Newberry businessmen really protested having cars. And he thought that the contraptions, as they were called, would scare the horses and cause cows to produce sour milk. And so when the first cars came, the village council passed a special ordinance saying that stipulating that the cars could not be left without tying, and the speed of the autos could not go more than 2 miles an hour. And there were severe penalties if the cars should have elected to climb any telephone poles.
So it seemed like there was it wasn't something that was embraced with open arms by some of the locals.
No, it wasn't, and of course there were just a few in those days. But by 1912, the Newberry News said there were 12 autos listed in Newberry.
Oh, wow.
And some of the auto owners were Dr. EH Campbell, who was the medical superintendent at the Upper Peninsula Hospital. He had a 1908 REO. John H. Hunter was a local lumberman. He had a 1910 Cadillac. And I do have a postcard with his car, 1910 Cadillac, parked in front of the Hunter house, which was on Main Street. It was a big deal. And then Dr. Campbell and his wife and Dr. and Mrs. Perry went to McMillan in October of 1908 to attend the dedication of the Methodist Church, which is still standing and still used in McMillan. And when they brought their car to attend the church service, it was supposedly the first car ever witnessed in McMillan. and the enthusiasm of the car rivaled the dedication. So with the cars coming to Newberry, that meant that car dealerships were going to open up. So one of the first auto dealers in Newberry was owned by James C. Foster, who owned Foster's Hardware. He sold Fords originally and then transitioned to selling Buick automobiles. A new Ford car cost $495 and $595.
And when was this?
That would have been in the teens, 20s, and when purchasing a vehicle, the new owner had to pay so much per month before the delivery was made. Then in 1916, Newberry pioneer Matthew Sorrell owned the Sorrell's Livery. He was renting automobiles, and then by 1919, he started a Chevy dealership. And then after the old livery building burnt down, he built the garage that was on Main Street, which was M. Sorrell and Son, and then later it was Knopf Motors. In the late 1920s, William Carmody opened a Ford garage. It was called Newberry Motor Company, and that was across the street from us here at the Newberry News and next to the Falls Hotel was Carmody's Ford, or Newberry Motor Company, which was sold to Joseph P. Rahaley in 1950. In the wintertime, most people, I know I'd mentioned this in one of my other podcasts, but people put their cars up a lot of times in the winter. So that meant that people went back to using horse and sleigh and other modes of transportation. There were a lot of automobile accidents in those early days, and they were caused a lot by inexperience and the conditions of the roads. Horses sometimes were startled by autos, and people were thrown from their carriages. In 1912, an automobile was running at high speed and collided with a stump. And then a year later, there was a car passing a load of hay near Dollarville, and the driver drove his car too close to the ditch, caused the car to tip over. And there were automobile accidents by driving without headlights, collisions with trains. There were multiple. One that was came across was where the car was coming from from Deer Park in the 20s, and the headlights were out of order. So they was two brothers, and I think their younger sister. And they were driving the car, and the sister was riding on the running board with a flashlight, and they ran into a horse and buggy coming in the other direction, and she hit the horse and fell off the car. So there were just a lot of different auto accidents in those days.
When you look at kind of the auto industry and its history, it kind of is unique to show just how much times have changed in the past 100 years, where the total cost of a car is now the monthly payment of a car, and all these, like you said, just people not being used to driving cars or how to operate them caused quite the stir back in the day.
Yeah. And despite the many accidents that occurred in the old days, when I look through the newspaper, there were many Sunday drives that people would take over to Curtis and Rexton and Lakefield area, and those were, Sunday drives were really popular. And by the late 1920s, automobiles were starting to appear around Newberry, or the average individual could acquire a car, and that was thanks to Henry Ford's Model T. And then eventually you had the filling stations appearing, and we had several in the old days of Newberry with the visible pumps where they had the big glass where the gas was visible when they were pumping it. So that's why we had Ford dealership, Dodge, Chevrolet, Oldsmobile, and we had many different variety of automobile dealerships.
And how did the increase in transportation and seeing more automobiles. How did that change kind of the day-to-day living and the business aspect of things in Newberry?
Well, there was a lot of changes. In the old days, most people relied on going back and forth by train, and locally with horse and carriage or sleigh in the wintertime. But roads, for many years, the roads were still weren't that great. But by looking at the photos from the late 20s and 30s, when the cars used to park on an angle on Main Street, and in the late 20s and 30s, downtown was filled with cars. So that meant that people were touring. They had the Pikers. They in the 20s, I know they had these trips that they'd go to Chicago and different places. There was a auto club from the Sioux. It was called the Pikers. So auto tours were becoming popular. So it really changed the landscape and the way of life in the country.
So there's your history of automobiles in Newberry. Quite the interesting backstory there, going back almost 120 years.
Yeah. Yep.
All right. Storytime with Sterling. Each and every week, Sterling will be back with another great topic again next week. Sterling, thank you.
Thank you.